Hello. Hello and welcome to this January 19th, 2021 program sponsored by the League of Women Voters Grand Traverse Area and hosted by Traverse Area Community Media. My name is Ann Magoon and I am a League member moderating today's program. The League of Women Voters is a national, nonpartisan organization. The League does not endorse or oppose candidates or political parties, but it does work to obtain and distribute information to the public about candidates and their views. The League promotes the informed and active participation of all citizens in government. It works to increase understanding of public policy issues, and it influences public policy through education and advocacy. Membership in the League of Women Voters is open to women and men of all ages, and we do offer a special student discount. Today, we have an important presentation by Dave Dempsey, Environmental Policy Specialist. His program, From PBB to Pfas, How We've Failed to Protect Our Health and Our Water from Toxic Chemicals, is being shown on Spectrum Cable Channel 189, Traverse Area Community Media Facebook page, and the League of Women Voters Grand Traverse Area Facebook page, and on Zoom. If you're watching this live on Facebook or Zoom, you can submit questions during the presentation in the comment section on Facebook or in the Q&A section on Zoom. Dave Dempsey is a senior policy advisor for the Traverse City-based organization For Love of Water, or FLOW. He has served as an environmental advisor to Michigan Governor James Blanchard, as an environmental specialist for the International Joint Commission, as a member of the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, and as a staff member of the Michigan Environmental Council and Clean Water Action. Dave is the author of 10 books, 3 of which are about the Great Lakes. So welcome, Dave. We're glad to have you here today.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So if you want to take it away with your presentation.
I will take it away. Just want to be sure it was time. Well, hello, everybody. It's good to be with you. And I'm glad to talk about one of my favorite subjects, water, and specifically today I'm going to focus on groundwater because I think that's the aspect of water that gets the least attention and deserves a lot more. So I'm going to focus on that. But when we have questions and answers, I'll be glad to respond to a question about anything that you need. Is the full screen shared or just? Can you see, Matt,
if you
see the full screen?
It's not full screen.
Okay. Just want to make sure I've got.
If you
How's
click
that?
on, yep, that's full screen now.
Great. Sorry about the technical issue. So before I get into the subject, I just want to tell you a little bit about the groundwater focus that I wanted to address today. As you heard, I was environmental advisor to Governor Blanchard, and that dates me. That was starting in 1983, believe it or not. I went from an environmental advocacy job right into the governor's office, and within a day or two, the groundwater issues leaped out at me because there was a major chemical contamination issue at Battle Creek. The entire water supply of Battle Creek was supplied by wells at the time, and there were 3 contamination sources of chemicals that were running towards the wells, and were getting close to contaminating the city water supply. So EPA and the state jumped in and hastily drilled some wells that protected the city water supply and headed off that crisis. That was kind of my baptism by fire for groundwater. Interestingly to me today, the chemical cleanup in that same site, the Battle Creek Verona well field, is continuing. 37 years later, we're still pumping TCE out of the ground and treating it and discharging it. So the cleanups was all, tell you, are going to take a lot of time. A little bit about FLOW. Maybe some of you already know about us, but I wanted to go over that again. We are a nonprofit based here in Traverse City whose mission is to safeguard the Great Lakes through the public trust doctrine in particular. And the public trust doctrine is a ancient principle of common law, which holds that common resources such as water, public resources, and that the government has an affirmative obligation to take care of those resources for the benefit of all. And recently that doctrine has been cited by Governor Whitmer in her order to Enbridge Energy to remove its pipelines from the state bottomlands at the Straits of Mackinac. The principle that she cited was this public trust doctrine because of the poor track record that Enbridge has had on maintaining its pipelines in the Straits. So our core objectives are to secure healthy Great Lakes and to especially build a movement that champions the public trust. And that means welcoming in the public to our work and also building alliances with groups across the state. So I want to start with talking about why is groundwater important, talk about the chemicals impacting it, health risks, policy changes, and what you can do to protect groundwater in particular. So I'm going to start with green ooze. You wonder why I'm focusing on green ooze? Well, it's been in the news in Southeast Michigan in the last year. You can see here this green ooze was flowing onto a freeway in Madison Heights. Kind of surprised the drivers and the environmental engineers in that area. Turns out the green ooze is chemical wastes that are flowing from groundwater, from a facility through groundwater onto I-696 and posing a health risk. So green ooze is what we're going to focus on today. Matt, I think that we're headed to the music slide now.
All right, just a moment while I switch screen shares.
Thank you. It's a little musical on Clay here.
Oops. Just a moment. Excuse our clunky technical difficulty.
My beginnings were in the air, in the vapors and in the clouds. I was rain, snowmelt collecting in the uplands, across the farmers' fields, below the leaves of the forests, slowly seeping into the earth, down through the lawns, the rows of corn at the edges of pavement, past the roots and creatures of the soil. Collecting myself, hidden in the pores of the earth, slipping slowly past grains of sand and gravel through the narrowest fractures in rock, always moving, flowing cool, silent, invisible. I am groundwater. Wherever you stand in Michigan, water may be seeping into the earth, down to where every opening is full of water. I am the water that saturates the earth beneath your feet. Sometimes very near, sometimes very deep, my undulating surface, the water table, is a subdued reflection of the topography you see. Languid, unhurried, almost imperceptibly, I flow beneath all of Michigan. I am the water that fills the wetlands and springs. I re-emerge at the sides and bottoms of rivers and lakes. I re-emerge through the pumps of your wells at thousands upon thousands of homes, hospitals, restaurants, and churches. Nearly half of your people depend on me for drinking, washing, and cooking. And yet, people can be so careless. The fertilizers, the 6,000 contamination sites, the 130,000 leaking septic systems and more release their poisons into the soil, slipping below the surface, joining the fluids sinking toward my water table. This is what you must know. What is done above can reach the water below and will join my slow, inexorable flow. Take care, for I will emerge from the ground one day through a drinking water well, into the rivers and lakes, and into the hands of a child digging in beach sand.
Other technical difficulties, excuse me. There we go. Sorry about that. I'm getting a little old for this newfangled technology here. Excuse me for that hitch. So why does groundwater matter and why should we care about it? There's a lot of reasons. That's why I like talking about it. There's about as much groundwater in the Great Lakes watershed as there is in Lake Huron. So imagine we call that flow, we call groundwater the sixth Great Lake, not because it's a lake. Actually, water is trapped between the pores of sand or in rock underneath the ground, but the volume is equal to a sixth Great Lake. About 45% of our state's population gets its drinking water from groundwater. We have more private water wells than any other state. Groundwater use is very extensive. We use it in this state for irrigation, for agriculture, for public water supply, and for industrial uses. To me, it's very important to know that about 40%, as much as 40% of the water of the Great Lakes begins as groundwater. That means that the rainfall or snowmelt that sinks into the soil will often discharge either directly to the Great Lakes or from the groundwater to streams throughout the Great Lakes basin. So without groundwater, our Great Lakes would be a lot different than they are today. So I just want you to visualize groundwater as being the sixth Great Lake. One of the important things to know about chemicals and groundwater is that groundwater is very hard to clean up. As I mentioned, the Battle Creek site has been cleaned up and continuing to be cleaned up for the last 4 decades. Once you pollute groundwater, it's very, very difficult to get it out of the ground. Treatment technologies are very expensive, sometimes in the tens of millions or even the hundreds of millions per site. And prevention, therefore, is the key to protecting groundwater. It's so much cheaper and more effective to prevent groundwater from being chemically contaminated. A couple other groundwater issues I want to get into before focusing on chemicals. We're the only state in the nation without a uniform septic code for septic systems. It means 49 other states protect their groundwater and their surface water from waste from septic tanks around the state. Michigan is the only state without that, and it's kind of an embarrassment for the state to be in that position. The State Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy estimates about 10% of all septic systems are leaking at any one time. That means thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of gallons of sewage contaminated water are getting into our lakes and streams or into our drinking water supplies in rural areas. More than 2,000 contamination sites around Michigan are considered off limits. Instead of cleaning them up, the state policy for the last 25 years has been to essentially write them off and restrict the use of those sites for drinking water, instead allowing the contamination to remain in the ground, which means in essence, there have to be either local ordinances or deed restrictions that prevent people from using the groundwater. We have about 6,000 so-called orphan contamination sites that need cleanup. Those are sites for which there's no responsible party. Usually it means the party or the company that contaminated the groundwater is bankrupt, or it happened so long ago that we can't even figure out who the owner and liable party was. And there's also over 1,000 sites where contaminated groundwater is leaking into lakes and streams. A little bit about the history of groundwater contamination in Michigan. I want to focus you on the upper right. That's one of the case studies, the Mancelona Contamination. Over 50 years ago, a site at Mancelona was using TCE, trichloroethylene, which is a chemical that's used in degreasing machinery, amongst other things. And that was sloppily handled, so the contamination or the chemicals got into groundwater. It's been flowing to the northwest ever since. It's one of the biggest contamination plumes in the country. About 13 trillion gallons of groundwater have been contaminated by this TCE, which is about 17 years worth of water flowing out of the Great Lakes at Chicago. This is one of the cases where we are not cleaning up the groundwater because the extent or the distance of the plume is so long and so expansive that it would cost hundreds of millions of dollars to remedy that groundwater. So instead, the state is paying for private wells that are in the way of the contamination that are being fouled by the chemicals. The state is replacing those private wells with hookups to municipal waters. So that's the remedy while the groundwater continues to be contaminated. The efforts to control contamination of groundwater go all the way back to the 1950s. At that time, the state decided that it was not necessary to protect groundwater from chemicals, but finally around 1980, the state DNR did impose groundwater discharge requirements. In 1988 and 1998, the state approved, or voters approved, I should say, bond issues that include hundreds of millions of dollars for contamination cleanup. We don't have funds from that source available anymore, although we do have some replacement sources. It's estimated that we need about $70 million more per year over the next 20 years to be able to clean up all the sites that exist across Michigan. These are some of the major sources of groundwater contamination besides chemicals, but won't get into those much today. Septic systems, as I mentioned, and nitrates from agricultural practices, particularly the application of animal waste and fertilizers. Already covered that. I do want to point out the primary exposure to contaminated groundwater is through drinking water, but if you look at the cases at the lower left, there have been numerous sites in recent years where contaminated groundwater has actually vaporized and caused health risks inside buildings. We thought until about 10 years ago that we could leave contamination in place under buildings and it would not migrate upwards into the structures with impermeable barriers, but it turns out that some chemicals can vaporize and go into the indoors and be an inhalation risk. So in several cases, the state has evacuated residents or workers at facilities in order to allow ventilation of the chemicals. A little history of chemicals. I want to go back before PBB actually started in the 1940s. DDT is a chemical that I'm sure you've heard of, which was used in the World War II to protect our troops from lice and other pests. When the war ended, the manufacturers of DDT were looking for uses at home to continue to allow profit and production of DDT. As you can see, it was sold as a benefit in the household. Michigan played an interesting and important role in the discovery that DDT had side effects. Back in the 1950s, a professor at Michigan State, George Wallace, who was a bird lover, started noticing robins especially die off on the Michigan State campus, mass die-offs. It turns out that was related to the use of DDT to combat Dutch elm disease. His field work and his research papers then were used by Rachel Carson in her seminal book on chemical contamination in 1962 called Silent Spring. So Michigan plays an important role in her book. And Michigan became the first state to ban most DDT uses in 1969. EPA did not get around to doing that for 3 more years in 1972. When we banned DDT, you can see what happened to bald eagle populations in Southeast Michigan. Bald eagles were almost wiped out in Southeast Michigan. They were wiped out in Southeast Michigan and almost wiped out statewide because DDT caused egg thinning. So the birds, those were not reproducing. And now that we've eliminated most DDT in the environment, but not all, bald eagle populations are thriving. DDT is an example of chemicals that are particular problems in the Great Lakes region. We call them PBTs, or persistent bioaccumulative toxins. Persistent meaning that they last in the environment many years, decades or more, and do not break down. Bioaccumulative meaning that they build up in the food chain. So by the time you take a trace at the lower end of the food chain and build it up through the microorganisms, through fish, say, to bald eagles, and then other organisms at the top of the food chain, you have much higher concentrations of the chemical. And toxic, of course, meaning that it's harmful to life. PBB. I'm not sure how many of you out there will remember this, but I vividly remember this story from my high school years. The end result of PBB contamination was the slaughter of livestock and poultry and other farm animals because of the contamination. This is a picture of slaughtered animals being disposed of in a landfill in Mayo. How did it happen? Well, Velsicol Chemical, which is based in St. Louis, Michigan, North Alma, made two chemicals that had similar names. One was Nutrimaster for cattle feed, and one was Firemaster for a flame retardant. And apparently, a worker at the facility mistook the labels sometime in the summer of 1973 and accidentally put cattle feed in flame retardant containers and vice versa. So farmers fed, in essence, flame retardant to their cattle. And within several months, farmers noticed that their herds were acting strangely. They were showing signs of neurological problems and other health risks. And so there was a detective effort that went underway to find out what was causing that. After a while, it was discovered that PBB was the responsible chemical. Every citizen in Michigan who ate meat or drank dairy products or was consuming other animals in their diets had PBB within their bodies, and there was a major concern that we would have a cancer outbreak around the state. So ultimately, the federal government banned PBB. What we're finding out since 1973 is that there are long-term effects from PBB, especially in the farm families that were most exposed. And these are effects that carry on through the second and third generation, including cancers, miscarriages, thyroid problems, and other health effects. So through this chemical accident, people were exposed. Anybody who is alive now who was living in Michigan in 1973 almost certainly has PBB in their blood and tissue. So what happened next? Well, we banned one fire retardant and replaced it with something called PBDEs, or polybrominated diphenyl ethers. And as is often the case with chemicals, bans and replacements, inadequate testing was done to find out what the replacements would do. After about 10 or 15 years, it turned out that PBDEs also had toxic effects, as you can see here, particularly neurotoxicity, and were dangerous to human life. And so they were also banned and phased out over about a 10-year period. Now we're talking about PFAS chemicals in Michigan's environment and also nationally. These are chemicals that have useful properties for many uses. Hydrophobic, meaning that repels water. So you may have boots, for example, that are treated with PFAS. Also, it repels oil, fat, and grease. And we now have over 5,000 compounds in the PFAS family that are in use. Probably the most attention-getting use of PFAS is for firefighting foams. It's a very effective fire suppressant. But you can see some of the other uses on the left-hand side. Why are we concerned about PFAS? Well, they're pervasive, they're widespread in the environment. As I mentioned, they're persistent and bioaccumulative and associated with adverse health effects. And we're learning a lot more about PFAS as we go, and there's additional health effects being identified. And until recently, most states and the federal government did not have sufficient standards to protect and limit the exposure to PFAS. They're called the forever chemicals because of their long life in the environment. This graph kind of shows how they cycle in the environment. Governor Whitmer, when she came into office, promised to deal with PFAS by setting drinking water standards for maximum exposure to PFAS. And despite some bumps in the road, the state did in last August finalize new standards for these chemicals, very low standards. These are parts per trillion for most of the compounds that are in single or double digit level. So these are very minute quantities that are needed to protect human health. So Michigan now is among 3 states that I think has the most stringent or most protective drinking water standards for PFAS, which is a good thing. You may have heard about PFAS in the Traverse City area recently. About 20 homes in the Pine Grove neighborhood that are affected by contaminated water in their wells. And adjacent to these homes, there was PFAS in groundwater found at almost 18,000 parts per trillion. And the state standard is now 16 parts per trillion. So it's way above. I don't know for sure what the drinking water well tests have revealed yet, but it may well be in the range above the drinking water standard. It's believed, but it's not certain, that the contamination is a result of the use of firefighting foams at the airport and at Coast Guard facilities. This is an illustration of the TCE plume I was mentioning earlier, showing you the distance that it's traveled close to, but not yet at the Shanty Creek well field. So it's traveled many miles through the groundwater. Chemical whack-a-mole is what we've been doing. As I mentioned, we find one chemical to be toxic and dangerous to human health and the environment, and then we institute or introduce new chemicals to the environment which are also hazardous, and that's a major flaw in our environmental policies. What can we do about that? Well, in the first place, we need to start treating chemicals that are introduced to the marketplace as something that should be evaluated before people are exposed to it. We essentially have a system where chemicals are innocent until proven guilty. That is, there has to be data to show that there is a harm before it's restricted, as opposed to putting the burden of proof on the manufacturer to demonstrate safety. We also need to start dealing with specific chemicals that pose unreasonable risks. I mentioned TCE, which is a degreaser. EPA recently, and this is under the Trump administration, evaluated the uses of TCE in commerce and found that 52 of 54 uses did present an unreasonable risk. So that's a chemical that we need to ban for most uses. On the positive side, we need to promote green chemistry. That means working with industries to devise processes by which compounds can be developed that have the least possible adverse effect on the environment and human health. Michigan and the Granholm administration actually had a green chemistry initiative that set environmental advocates, state government, and industry down to discuss and move ahead on these initiatives. We also need to better protect groundwater for the reasons that I mentioned, the value of groundwater to Michigan's environment and economy. We do not have a state policy on groundwater. That is, we do not have goals and values that we articulate in our statutes to manage our groundwater. We have a patchwork of protections across various programs and laws ranging from landfills that leak to underground storage tanks to industrial discharges and other separate pieces of policy. So we need to articulate something, put it all together under one roof. We need to also set a goal of protecting our groundwater for the highest use, which is drinking water. If we protect groundwater for that use, it means all other uses are viable because drinking water needs to be as clean as possible. What we have now is what we call dead zones, which are areas, as I mentioned, where it's legal to allow contamination to remain in place and restrict human use of the groundwater instead of restricting the contamination itself. There may be many sites from past years that are abandoned that we cannot totally clean up, but any sites that are created from now henceforth should be cleaned up entirely. As I mentioned, we need to find financial or funding sources for cleanup of contamination to get the job done in the next 20 years. And we need to emphasize prevention better. We have very little in the way of help for industries, particularly small businesses, to avoid contamination and substitute from chemical and toxic processes to non-toxic processes. We also need to do better health studies, in particular about PFAS. We're looking to find what the impact has been of PFAS on communities across the state. We know that in some of the most affected communities, there seems to be elevated rates of cancer and other disease, but we can't yet associate that directly with PFAS exposure. The same applies to other chemicals, so there needs to be more emphasis on trying to discern the effect on our population. Now, what can you do to protect our water? Well, here's a couple of examples for you. Everything from avoiding toxic lawn fertilizers, getting active on groundwater and septic system legislation in the next 2 years, 4 years in Michigan. Read our report, The Sixth Great Lake. check your septic system, and dispose of used oil and other substances properly. So that's my presentation. I'm glad to open it up for questions. I think we'll go through Ann or somebody else for that. So thank you for your time.
Right, that was excellent. See if I can get my video on. Okay, thank you. That had tremendous amount of information coming right at us. So we thank you for pulling it all together in that useful way. We do have some questions for you, and I'll start with one. Are there any federal laws or policies that apply to remedying or preventing more problems from PFAS in Michigan?
Regarding PFAS, we're just starting to get federal policies enacted. Our congressional delegation, Michigan's congressional delegation, has been very active because we have a couple of the major PFAS sites in Michigan. One is the former Wolverine Worldwide facility near Grand Rapids, which manufactured footwear and other products that whose processes have leaked PFAS into the environment through groundwater. And also the former Wurtsmith Air Force Base by Oscoda has a major contamination plume. So members of Congress from those areas have been very active. We do not have a federal cleanup standard for PFAS. We do not have much in the way of prevention at the federal level, but there's now efforts to get the Defense Department, which is responsible for these former military bases, to remediate the sites. That's what's happening now. So primarily we're looking at the remedial side of it, not the prevention side. And there needs to be more done at the federal level to restrict that. But failing federal efforts, the states are going to have to pick up the slack. I should say that actually starting under Governor Snyder, but particularly under Governor Whitmer, the state has been very active on PFAS, at least in the sense of monitoring groundwater and finding out where PFAS contamination exists and trying to begin the process of cleaning it up.
Thank you. Another question just came in. Have the PBBs finally been eliminated or fully mitigated in the state of Michigan by now?
Well, in terms of current exposures, yes, we do not have PBB in the food chain or in our drinking water, and that's been true for a number of years. We do have it, if you've been a resident of Michigan since the 70s, you do have it in your body. Hopefully, it won't be at the level that will cause a significant or any health effect, but it will not be eliminated totally from the environment for probably centuries.
Okay. Now, are there other states? Michigan used to be a leader in environmental protection. We were at the forefront and known for that. In the 21st century, are there other states that now have taken the lead that have model or better regulations and policies than we do?
Well, it's true. We've lost our leadership reputation. Back in the 70s and the 80s, Michigan was considered kind of at the vanguard of protecting the environment. We had one of the first states, as I mentioned, to ban DDT, PCBs, one of the first states to have a biodeposit law, one of the first states to pass a wetland protection law, and so forth. We have not been doing that in recent years, although I do want to point out Governor Whitmer with the PFAS drinking water standards has put Michigan back in amongst the leaders of those states. Probably the states that are the current leaders around the country are Minnesota, California, Vermont, a couple others, but we can learn from those states and hopefully promote some innovative reforms here.
Thank you. Question came in. My log home burnt in 2013. We are up on a hill. The entire hole in the ground later we saw had been foamed. Where do you suggest we get our well water tested?
Sometimes county health departments will do it. The state health department will do it as well. If I can get your contact information, I'll check that for you and provide that to you. So
for the person asking that question, if you could provide contact information to, through the question and answer, we'll try to follow up on that. Now, this is a question, and I'm not quite sure where they're going with it, but can you go back to the whack-a-mole slide?
Okay. Just a second. Let me.
Little technical question there.
Okay. Almost there. I go right back. Oh, there it is. So that's the slide. These are all chemicals that have been banned and replaced by chemicals that, well, banned or limited, I should say, have been replaced by materials that are equally or at least significantly toxic as well.
Okay, I don't know if there's a follow-up question on that, but if you could leave that slide up for a little bit, that might be
Sure.
good. We have more questions about groundwater and well water and how people figure out what their condition is. So in general, I have a question. What triggers a community or an individual to suspect toxic contamination and ask for testing? And maybe an example would be the Pine Grove neighborhood. How do we know that there was a problem?
Well, you know, that's interesting because a lot of chemical contaminants or just contaminants in general in groundwater do not have, I should say some do not have odor or taste issues. So you may never know you're drinking something contaminated until well after you start. In the case of PFAS, the state has been doing did an inventory of sites that had potential to contaminate groundwater. And so the state Department of Eagle went out across the state and began sampling near airports in particular because of the firefighting foams. And that's how the contamination was discovered in the Pine Grove neighborhood, because it was downstream, so to speak, and the groundwater flow was downstream to these residences. So it was not a matter of the citizens complaining about a taste or odor problem. It was actually the state that was doing the investigations. So that's often the way that these things are identified. Many people who are on wells, I should say, do not realize that unlike municipal water, their water is not tested on a regular basis. All community water supplies that provide public water are required to monitor regularly, whereas obviously for a private well, that would be up to the homeowner to pay for it. And most do not think to do that or have the resources to do that.
So along those lines, then, if I were to ask to have my well tested, just a standard testing, like say for a new well, would a PFAS test be included in that, or is that a special request for probably an additional cost?
That would be an additional request and probably an expensive sampling to do. It would be possible for the state to pay for that if it happened to coincide with an area that they're investigating, but for the most part, the burden would be on the private well owner. So that's something that actually at Flow we're thinking about. We want to identify a funding source that would assist homeowners to get those kinds of tests done. Rural well owners really need that service at least a partial state public subsidy.
Thank you. We have other questions about funding. Are there funds available for well testing? It sounds like not just the average homeowner who is looking for confirmation that their well is okay or is a problem. Right. Okay.
There is no funding for that.
So what is the status of groundwater contamination at the previous Norris Elementary School and Holiday Gas Station on M22. That's on the west side of Traverse City.
I'm not familiar with that site, but again, that's a site I could check into. I did not know it had been contaminated, so I can't really respond to that, but I'll be glad to check. So maybe we can get that information in a chat box too.
Okay, thank you. Are there any home water filters that you would recommend that people consider? And second question from the same person, how are municipal waters tested?
As far as the home treatment, usually reverse osmosis or carbon filtration are recommended. I'd have to look it up to see which is appropriate for which contaminants, and be glad to do that. Municipal water is tested by the municipality that operates the facility. Usually, if it's a large facility, a community water supply, it usually be done on a daily or weekly basis. So it's almost continuous. And those results are required to be reported not just to the state that regulates those facilities, but also there's an annual consumer confidence report that the utility will issue to all of its customers. Maybe one of those pieces of paper you get in your bill that you just discard or recycle. So it would require you to be expecting it to come, or you can go on the website of the facility or the municipality and look it up. They'll have the data and will report which compounds exceeded the drinking water standards, if any.
Thank you. Dave, now we have a question, and I know you've touched on this, but maybe you could review a little bit. What is Flow doing now? Could you discuss what is Flow doing now regarding, or going forward regarding groundwater issues?
We're doing a couple of things. Education, obviously, like presentations like today, we do those on a regular basis. We are working with many allies across the state to try to get groundwater legislation moving forward or developed. One of the primary areas that we hope to see action is on the septic system contamination problem. Because I mentioned that we're the only state of the union that does not have some kind of statewide septic code. So that will be something we hope to get moving in this session of the legislature. And we'll also be working with some local governments around the region that are interested in enacting local township or county ordinances as well. There's some effort to do that out in Leelanau County. That's been going on for a couple of years. And so education and legislation are the primary focuses that we have. And we have a whole program called the 6th Great Lake, which you can find out about on our website, that has a list of our activities in that area. We'd like to get more citizens involved in groundwater protection because it's frequently just like groundwater itself, a problem or an issue that's out of sight, out of mind.
True. So you mentioned avoiding this is another question. I'm not speaking for myself here. You mentioned avoiding fertilizer on my lawn, which I do avoid. What can you say about Roundup? Does it cause groundwater contamination?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I haven't heard of cases in Michigan, but if it would make sense that at least in the sandy soil areas that it would get into groundwater. Best thing is to avoid Roundup.
Okay, and I think we ought to make sure that everybody understands Roundup is not a fertilizer. So don't ever confuse the two. It's
right.
To kill plants, not to help them grow.
Right.
But don't use them anyway. Okay, let's see. So are the PFAS locations, like maybe the Oscoda Air Base and the Mancelona site, are those Superfund sites? Is there any federal money going in to clean those up?
No, not for PFAS. The major federal funding that's needed for PFAS is for the military bases, which are all across the country. And the Defense Department's not particularly anxious to put its funds into environmental cleanup. We do have Superfund sites in the state which are federally funded cleanups, but to my knowledge, they do not include PFAS related sites.
Back to the statement that it's probably a separate test to have your well water tested for PFAS and it's expensive. Can you give us an idea of what you mean by expensive? Are you talking hundreds of dollars or more or less?
In the hundreds, I would say. It's, I believe, less than $1,000, but that's still pretty hefty price tag for a citizen to pay.
Right.
The cheaper tests are for nitrates or E. coli. Those are standard and they're much lower cost.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Now back to flow and your Sixth Great Lake and some of the other initiatives. Are there paper handouts or do you have PDFs on the website that could be downloaded for distribution about some of these initiatives that Flow's undertaking?
Yes, we have in the Sixth Great Lake program, we have both a report and a fact sheet that are downloadable PDF formats. The report is probably about 24 pages. And of course, the fact sheet, just one front and back of one sheet. So we have that. We have similar documents for most of our programs on the website. We don't do much on paper anymore because saves trees and most people are able to download documents at any rate.
Okay, so going to the website would be the best approach there. So here's a question. I think I know the answer. Are PFAS still being used in the United States? Where and by whom?
Yeah. Yes, for many uses, they're still being employed. As I mentioned, there's over 5,000 different compounds in the PFAS family. You know, they're being phased out for some uses, but many of the uses, if not most, continue to this day. So we're still probably creating contamination sites as we try to deal with past sites.
Right. And what other groups are leaders in developing water quality standards and regulations? And then what groups are opposing such regulations?
Well, we have a very vibrant environmental community across the state that's working on water quality standards. In the case of septic systems, we're going to be partnering with local health departments, which are also very active in the health-related side of water quality. You know, when we talk about opposition, it really depends on what particular issue we are addressing. In the case of septics, for example, many communities have tried to enact ordinances that require septic system testing at the time you sell your property, which could be, you know, anything from a few months to many decades before you transfer the property. There is opposition to that from the real estate community because they do not want the transactions to be burdened with that that cost. So other communities have proposed periodic inspections that would not be linked to the transfer of the property, and of course those do not have the same opposition from realtors, but they frequently have opposition from let's say more conservative politicians who think that that's a burdensome requirement. It's, you know, to me, it's as important as having your roof inspected when you transfer the property. It's safety of your groundwater is just as important.
Right. Are there any substitutes for PFAS so that we could get away with them but have the same benefits that they seem to offer to the for flame retardants or keeping your shoes dry or whatever?
There are, again, I would have to provide that information later to be specific about it, but there is research into green alternatives that's been successful for some uses, but I'd have to check on that to be more, to give you a real answer, full answer.
Okay, so there might be substitutes out there so that we don't just have to give up the benefits of the commercial
Right.
PFAS.
One example is that PFAS is actually used in some food packaging. I think McDonald's just committed to phasing out PFAS in their packaging. There's certainly alternatives to PFAS in that use.
Okay. We have a question. Could you please repeat the website address for Flow?
Yeah, I think it's flowforwater.org. I think I would know that, but yeah, for loveofwater.org, excuse me, just checking right here. For loveofwater.org. Glad I had that handy.
Okay.
Thanks, Liz.
Thank you for that. Now, who is responsible for actually doing the testing? And I assume the monitoring itself would be done at the municipal level for drinking water. But who does the testing for PFAS? Are there commercial laboratories, or how does that work?
I believe that's how they're tested, through private laboratories, but again, I'm not really sure of that. I should be. I'm sorry about that, but I don't believe this state is doing that, but let me check.
Right, and we do have a plea, and I think this is from many of us. You have mentioned a few things citizens can do beyond writing to our legislators and taking the steps in our own personal lives, like avoiding the contaminants in our own lives. Is there anything else that we can do to change the culture that accepts these contaminants?
Well, I want to say one thing about groundwater quantity as well that you can do. The same water conservation techniques that are discussed for other sources of water, like lakes and streams, apply to home use of groundwater. And in fact, it's much more important to conserve groundwater or well water, because once you draw groundwater up through a well and discharge it, you're essentially mining the groundwater. That water is not going to go back in the ground in most cases. So you're pulling it out of the ground and discharging it to a river, and it goes away someplace. So conserving water, groundwater, is very important for that purpose. What was the rest of the question? I kind of lost track there. Could you repeat it, please?
It was really just what can we as citizens do to try to change the culture toward the importance of groundwater and trying to get away from contaminants?
Well, we need advocates. Flo could use help in this regard, but most environmental groups as well, just to educate people about groundwater. I don't think most people realize that almost half the state gets its drinking water from groundwater. So trying to help make people aware of its importance is one thing. As far as reorienting our practices and our culture to avoid contaminants, that's a big battle that applies across the board with environmental issues. Everything from organic foods to benign lawn care products are important. They frequently cost more upfront, and that's the problem that some people have with these alternatives. But I think if people are aware that there is groundwater that can be protected or contaminated based on individual practices, we can do a lot more. But until we're aware of groundwater, we're not going to see the impact and the benefit. So
Right.
Basically, awareness is the key.
So I'm not sure if I'm confusing this with another chemical, but I've heard that fleece garments, the fleece jacket I frequently wear and fleece bathrobe and whatnot, when they go through the washing machine and the water goes into the whatever system it is, that's a contaminant, that the little fleece particles are bad for our environment. Is that related to PFAS?
No, it's more a matter of microplastics or microfibers that get into the environment, and those can not only cause what you would call as unsightly problems with water, but it can also pass up the food chain into birds and other animals and fish. So that's more of a microplastics issue. A lot of our consumer products and items that we consume in our clothes or in our foods or in our packaging are generating these particles that are building up to significant numbers in both the Great Lakes and the oceans.
Thank you. Can you explain what MPART is and how that relates to the what we're talking about today?
Yeah, MPART is the name of the state task force that's dealing with PFAS. I don't recall the exact words that the acronym defines, but it's something like Michigan PFAS Action and Research Team or something like that. So it's the several state agencies, including the health department, EGLE, even transportation through the airports that are all working together on PFAS issues at the state level.
Okay. And so someone says that they do have a website and we can get more information on PFAS from the MPART website. But that's a state, it sounds like a state, either organization or coalition that's working together.
Correct. I don't know the URL, but if you go to the EGLE website, michigan.gov, and then put in EGLE, on their homepage, they have a link to the MPART program.
Okay. And to remind people who have been around for a while but get confused with acronyms, EGLE is a replacement for which former,
Yeah, well,
or is that a combination?
It used to be called the DEQ, originally DNR, then DEQ, and now it's been broken into EGLE. So it's environment, Great Lakes, and energy. There's still a DNR that handles fish and game, forests and parks. It's a separate agency.
Right, thank you. DEQ is now EGLE, got it.
Right.
As climate change warms our northern Michigan area, will the groundwater availability become less and thus concentrate the toxic chemicals in the water?
I don't think it'll become less in the foreseeable future, but what will happen is that both surface water and the groundwater that feeds it will warm. I should have mentioned that most of the trout streams in Michigan, including the Ausable River, are dependent on groundwater because groundwater supplies a steady flow of cool water that is necessary to trout populations. But as temperatures warm, groundwater and surface water will warm, and that could be a threat to our trout streams. That's an example of an impact. I don't think the quantity is going to be a problem for some time to come. We're still seeing in the region, as you probably know, record precipitation events where we have these huge storms. 30 years ago, when climate change first became an issue, the vision for our region was that there would be long dry spells and falling Great Lakes water levels. We've seen just the reverse. And it looks like at least the short term, in the terms of decades, the impact of climate change on our particular part of the world is going to be more frequent, intense storms that actually raise our water levels. But the warming is more important than the drying at this point.
Okay. Now we have a question about vineyards in Grand Traverse and Leelanau County and the effect of some of the practices. So it's a long question. With the influx of vineyards in Grand Traverse and Leelanau County, is there anyone in charge of keeping account of how much chemical fertilizer and insect control, et cetera, is being used and how much of it goes into our groundwater? We have such a high rate of cancer, especially breast cancer, in these two counties. I can't help but suspect that there is a link. Is there anyone monitoring the impact of the growing number of vineyards and hops farms and their chemical use?
Not to my knowledge. There is no particular agency or department of state government or local government, for that matter, that would be monitoring that. I know that there was a epidemiologist who looked at, I think, cancer rates, breast cancer rates, and the Grand Traverse area a couple of years ago that found some reason for concern linked to chemicals, but that's the only thing I've ever heard about that particular issue. There's no regular governmental monitoring of those vineyards for chemicals, either in the surface or groundwater.
Okay, thank you. And certainly we've had intensive agriculture for many, many years before we had vineyards with different chemical needs, I'm sure. Okay, I don't see any more questions. Whoop, we have one more. I would like to ask, you've been in this field for quite a long time, and I'd like to wrap up with an opportunity for you to tout any really good news, either repeat something that you said earlier or any other real successful things that we can go away on a high note, not feeling too depressed about the things that we're facing. So thinking over your career.
There's plenty of good news. I don't want people to be paralyzed into inaction because of the pessimism and despair. There's plenty of good stuff. I mentioned the recovery of bald eagles as a result of banning certain chemicals. We're seeing that for other wildlife and bird species. The bans have been really effective in that area. We have a great natural resources trust fund in this state, which was something that the voters approved back in 1984, which directs royalties from oil and gas development on state land into a fund that buys and protects recreational and environmentally important land. So we've spent over $1 billion in funds from that resource trust fund, and it's bought all kinds of public lands around the state. We're probably amongst the 50 states, we're probably the state that has the biggest and best program for that. A lot of our local conservancies, regional conservancies also identify some lands to be protected and then purchase the land, and then the state will take it off their hands. So that's a model for the country. Let me think of some other good news. There is plenty. I'm just drawing a blank right now, but there's all kinds of good things that happen in Michigan's environment. We've shown over time that when we put our minds to it, we can do a lot of good things on the environment. The challenges are just so diverse right now that it's difficult to get people to focus on any particular issue. Our air quality in Michigan actually is pretty good. We have not had too many air advisory days in the last decade, certainly not in northern Michigan, and very few in southeast Michigan. We've done a pretty good job of cleaning up the air, except in certain areas of Detroit, which are still problems and need to be addressed for environmental justice reasons. But our ozone levels in particular are pretty low. We don't see that like we used to. Our handling of solid waste is improved, even though we're generating too much of it. We have not had landfills that leak in many years, thanks to state standards that were put in place in the 1980s to require better protection of groundwater. A problem that comes to mind that in the reverse side I should mention is that we have far too little public funding that's going into wastewater facilities and drinking water facilities. Many of our communities have sewage plants and drinking water treatment plants that are near the end of their design life, and we need to put more money into that. There's an estimated annual need of about $900 million in this state alone to better protect or upgrade our sewage and drinking water systems. Hopefully the new administration in Washington will provide more assistance to the states to allow that to happen. But we also need to come up with funding within the state to pay for that. And of course, it's a jobs program that would be created. In terms of energy, there's all kinds of good news in terms of improved energy efficiency over the last couple of decades and the shift to renewable energy. We can do a lot more in that area, but solar and wind are really taking off in Michigan and filling a much bigger part of our energy needs than before. That's good news. there's plenty. I can make a list and spend the entire day talking about it. I have thought, if once I retire, if I ever do, of creating a website that just has environmental good news. I think people would enjoy logging on occasionally and just saying, hey, this is good, I'm glad to know about it. Because for every problem that we can identify, we can also identify a solution that's been put in place. So take heart, we're making progress in some areas and we can do a better job in all areas. And we will.
Thank you, Dave. That's very helpful. And I think we do need to remember that we can make a difference and that we have made differences in the past. The bald eagle story is something we all need to remember.
Let me just say one additional thing. My first book was called Ruin and Recovery. It was a history of Michigan conservation going back to the 1800s. And the thing that I learned, and I hope I conveyed in that book, is that we are the leaders. We sometimes think of elected officials or appointed officials in government as being the leaders on issues like the environment, but every single environmental reform that's happened over the last 150 years in Michigan is a result of citizens taking the lead and pressuring the office holders. That's how it gets done. So we can't look elsewhere for leadership. We have to provide it. And when we do, as citizens, we frequently see big results.
Well, that's very good news. And we do need to underscore that it's up to us to make a difference. So I'd like to thank you very much, Dave, for your presentation and imparting so much information, and also to the audience for tuning in today and for the good questions that you've asked. If you still have questions, if you want to continue to submit them on the Traverse Area Community Media Facebook page, if you can do that, then we can forward those to Dave and perhaps get answers for you. And this program can be, we can continue to, you can share this program with your friends through the Traverse Area Community Media Facebook page or on their website. And it may also be reshown on Spectrum Cable Channel 189 in the future. So I'd like you to remember that you can find out more about the League of Women Voters, about what we do, who we are, and how to join. Please go to our website. It should be showing on your screen right with my name, lwvgta.org. Now, before we end, I'd like to draw your attention to some upcoming League of Women Voters programs. And all of these will be virtual, at least through the first part of this year. And we hope eventually we'll get back to real life in-person programming. But these programs will be the third Tuesday of the month, and they will start at 1 o'clock. On February 16th, Nico Pandolfi will be presenting on bias in the media. March 16th, it will be Simon D. Schuster, who is the Executive Director of the Michigan Campaign Finance Network. He will talk about dark money in the Michigan 2020 election. In April, the program will be on gerrymandering, and this will be a special presentation by Donna Hornberger and Mary Leary. Donna is a League of Women Voters of Grand Traverse area member, and Margaret Leary is from the Ann Arbor League. And they'll be talking about what they are observing as part of the State League Observer Corps, watching the actions of the Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission. And this commission was created after the statewide Proposal 2 passed in 2018. So now there is a requirement in the Michigan Constitution that a commission made up of citizens will be creating the fair congressional and state legislative district boundaries. So the State League has an observer corps to oversee what the Independent Commission is doing. On May 18th, there will be a program on the Electoral College, and details and speaker on that will be announced soon. Next fall, there will be more programs after a hiatus over the summer. So I just want to thank everybody again today for being part of this. Thank you to our technical advisor and consultant, Matthew Kern from Traverse Area Community Media, and thanks especially to Dave Dempsey for your presentation today.
Hey, Ann, sorry Oh, sorry to interrupt. I just got a correction from Cheryl that those programs begin at noon. I'm not sure exactly what time you may have said, but those programs
I'm
begin at
sorry.
noon.
They do programs all begin at noon. I don't know what time I said. Okay, that's it.
Sorry for my interruption.
We're all set.